Welcome to a new deep dive. Today, we're really unpacking a truly urgent global issue. But before we dive into today's topic, we do want to recommend Hui Wang's A History of China series. It's just been updated with the Liao dynasty. You can find it in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Definitely one for the historical reading list.
Oh, absolutely. It's a fantastic series. Hui Wang really gives you that deep historical context, which actually is sort of what we're aiming for today, too, just in a very different very current situation.
Right. So today we're turning our attention to Gaza.
Exactly. And what's striking here is that it's not just, a conflict zone anymore. It's a severe humanitarian catastrophe. Yeah. Some of our sources even go so far as to describe the famine situation there as a political game.
A political game. That's a really strong phrase. It kind of stops you in your tracks because, many might have assumed Gaza was maybe stabilizing after those reports in early 2025 suggested Hamas had lost its fighting capacity.
That's what was reported, yes.
But then reports from just June 2025 painted a completely different picture, didn't they? An acute food shortage. And here's where it gets really complex and frankly disturbing. The sources suggest the shortage wasn't primarily from a lack of supply at the source, but from deliberate blockages in transport.
Exactly. The aid wasn't getting through.
So what does this all mean for the people actually living there? And what are these, hidden forces or strategies at play?
Our mission today is to try and pull apart the layers of this crisis.
Yeah.
Look at the human suffering, yes, but also these complex political strategies.
Okay, so to really grasp the current devastation, we need a little context. Where were things before October 2023? Well, Gaza had about 2.1 million residents, and they actually produced a fair amount of their own food, maybe around 40%. Agriculture, some livestock.
40%. Okay, so not self-sufficient, but significant.
Right. The other 60%, that relied heavily on international aid. We're talking 600, maybe 700 aid trucks entering daily. That was the baseline to sustain the population.
Wow, 600 to 700 a day. And then the war happened. How did that change things? It changed everything. Our sources indicate, the destruction was immense. 95% of Gaza's farmland gone, 85% of greenhouses destroyed. Almost all the livestock perished.
So that 40% local production just vanished.
Pretty much. And at the same time, the need for external food, for aid, surged by about 2/3, a huge jump. And then, crucially, Israel closed the southern crossings. That forced all aid to try and come through Egypt, which added massive logistical problems.
A logistical nightmare, I imagine, especially since, as you mentioned, the infrastructure within Gaza was also hit hard.
Absolutely. Around 2/3 of Gaza's roads were destroyed. Just getting aid trucks from the border to the people who needed it became incredibly difficult. And then you had other issues, like restrictions on hiring local Gazan staff for aid distribution, and, critically, a lack of guaranteed protection for the aid convoys from the Israeli military.
So aid couldn't move easily, and it wasn't always safe when it did. What did that mean for the actual volume getting in?
It plummeted. British aid worker Kelleher, who was there, estimated that during the first 14 months or so, deliveries sometimes dropped to as low as 40 trucks a day.
40. Down from 600, 700.
Yes. That's less than 4% of what was actually needed. Kelleher also talked about witnessing widespread looting of the few aid convoys that did get through. Just desperation adding to the chaos.
Was there any let-up, any periods where things improved?
There was a brief period, a ceasefire, in January 2025. For about 40 days, aid actually rebounded, got back up to around 600 trucks daily. A glimmer of hope.
But short-lived, he said.
Very short-lived. By March 2025, military operations started up again, and Israel began intercepting most food convoys, effectively imposing a blockade that lasted a punishing 80 days.
80 days. And after that, how were people supposed to get food?
Well, in late May 2025, a new system started. Residents could apply for food from the U.S.-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF.
Okay, the GHF. Did that help?
It helped some, but there was a huge catch. Food distribution was limited to just 4 points. 4. And all of them were located inside Israeli-controlled zones.
Inside Israeli zones, so people had to cross to controlled territory.
Exactly. Which meant these dangerous hours-long journeys on foot, often under the threat of gunfire, just to try and get some supplies.
That sounds incredibly perilous. Do we have accounts of what that was like?
We do. Journalist Gada, who's on the ground there, described it. From her refugee camp, it was a 20-kilometer walk. 20 kilometers. People would start walking 10, even 12 hours early, carrying pots, sacks, whatever they had, and they wouldn't even know what they'd get. Maybe some pasta, canned meat. Sometimes, she said, just tomato paste.
And the journey back, was that dangerous too?
Just as dangerous, if not more. Getting the food was only half the battle. The 20-kilometer trek back meant facing armed robbers, Israeli patrols, even clashes with other desperate refugees. And Gaza reported if Israeli soldiers thought things were getting too chaotic at the distribution points, they would sometimes just open fire.
Open fire on people trying to get food.
That's what the reports indicate. UN statistics suggest that since the GHF started distributions on May 26th, over 1,400 people have actually been shot trying to collect food.
1,400 people? That's horrific.
It's shocking. And because of that risk, the danger, the sheer physical effort involved, many Gazans told Gaza they only go once a week, trying to get enough food in one trip to feed a large family, maybe 7 or 8 people, for the entire week.
Once a week? I mean, just pause and think about that. Walking 20 kilometers, facing gunfire and robbery, not knowing what you'll get back, all to feed your family for potentially just a week. What stands out to you listening to this about that daily struggle?
The sheer scale of this catastrophe is, well, it's hard to comprehend. The World Food Program calculates Gaza needs about 62,000 tons of staple food every month. Yet since March 2025, the total amount that's arrived is less than 100,000 tons overall. That's a shortfall of nearly 70%.
70% less food than needed. What does that mean in human terms?
It means, according to reports, about 1/3 of all residents experience days without eating a single meal. Not skipping a meal, skipping entire days of eating. In July 2025 alone, at least 120 people reportedly died from hunger in Gaza. And it disproportionately hits women, children, the elderly.
And the longer-term impact.
A study in The Lancet estimated nearly 20,000 deaths just from hunger and lack of related care in the first 9 months of the war. When you add in deaths from direct military action, the total losses could be as high as 5% of Gaza's entire pre-war population.
5%. That's staggering. So where does Gaza stand now in terms of official famine classifications?
According to the UN's criteria, Gaza is currently at level 3. That's serious, widespread, acute malnutrition, rising mortality. It's not yet level 5, which is the most catastrophic famine definition with mass death. However, a UN brief from July 23rd projected that 470,000 residents were on the verge of entering those level 5 famine conditions very soon.
So the situation is dire and potentially getting much worse. Which brings us back to that initial point you made, some sources calling this a political game. How does politics factor into this starvation?
Well, this is where we need to look at the system before the war and how it was dismantled. British famine expert Alex de Waal had an interesting description of pre-war Gaza. He called it an ordered society of shortage.
Ordered society of shortage, meaning?
Meaning, yes, there were Israeli blockades since 2007. Things were difficult, but it wasn't a wasteland. Gaza had irrigation, almost 15,000 hectares of farmland, livestock, fisheries. All that agriculture, fishing, animal husbandry created around 560,000 jobs, about 10% of Gaza's GDP. It contributed to that 40% food self-sufficiency we talked about.
Okay, so there was an internal economy, some local production, and for the rest, the imported 60%. You mentioned Hamas played a role.
A central role. Hamas, being in control since 2007, wasn't just a militant group, it was also the de facto government. They had taxed goods coming in, they operated some farms, they even leased property to the UN, generating income. And they received significant external funding, over $20 million a year from Iran, money from other Arab states. And interestingly, funding from Qatar that started in 2018 under the Trump administration.
Funding from Qatar facilitated by the U.S.?
Yes. Initially $15 million, later $30 million monthly. And sources suggest Israel was fully aware of this and basically approved it. Total direct financial aid to Hamas was likely over $300 million annually by 2023.
So Hamas had significant financial resources and managed the aid distribution system.
They were key players. International groups like UNRWA brought in supplies, flour, medicine, canned food through 3 checkpoints Israel permitted. Now, Israeli journalist Amit Segal claims Hamas diverted maybe 15–20% of this aid for its fighters or to resell. But even he conceded the majority, the bulk of it, did reach civilians.
So Hamas ran a civil service, industries, banks. It was a whole system, however flawed.
Exactly. It had its problems: inefficiency, corruption, very high youth unemployment, over 50%. But crucially, the basic food supply for the population was generally maintained under that system.
Until October 7th, 2023.
Precisely. After October 7th, the Israeli military operations began. Sources we looked at described the approach as involving collective punishment aimed at Gaza's infrastructure. The UN estimates are stark. 94% of hospitals damaged or destroyed, 89% of schools, 70% of all buildings, 77% of apartment buildings. The estimated reconstruction cost is $53 billion. That's 2.5 times the entire pre-war Palestinian GDP.
53 billion, just staggering. And that collapse included the food system.
Completely. The system that relied on external aid, managed partly by Hamas, distributed through networks, it just disintegrated.
Now, Israel's stated reason for some of its actions, particularly around aid later on, was, according to Amit Segal, not to starve people, but specifically to break Hamas's control over that aid. The thinking was that Hamas's control fueled anti-Israel sentiment.
That was the stated rationale, yes. And that's presumably why Israel allowed the U.S.-backed GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, to start providing aid in May 2025 as a sort of alternative channel.
But did it work? Did the GHF actually replace the old system or break Hamas's control?
Well, here's the crucial disconnect our sources point to. The GHF, with just 4 distribution points compared to over 400 pre-war locations, and crucially, no local staff network, it simply couldn't replace the capacity of the 170-plus aid groups that operated before. So did it break Hamas's control? Journalist Gaza confirms that black markets, often controlled by various armed groups, thrived throughout 2024. Essential goods were sold at 50, even 200 times their normal price. A kilo of flour for the equivalent of 200 RMB, roughly $30 US.
So restricting the official aid didn't stop armed groups controlling food, it just shifted it to a black market.
That appears to be the outcome. Alice Duvall makes a powerful point here. He argues that any continuous external food input, even if some gets diverted, significantly alleviates overall hunger. It reduces competition, lowers black market prices. By rejecting that approach, Duvall argues, Israel's policy meant that 95% of civilians suffered intensely in an attempt to target the less than 5% who might be Hamas fighters.
And does Hamas itself leverage this situation politically?
It seems so. Palestinian activist Al-Khatib notes that when Israel uses hunger as a weapon, it actually pushes Gazans, even those who might dislike Hamas's governance, towards resisting what they see as invaders. It builds solidarity against the external pressure. This, in turn, empowers Hamas. It gives them leverage in resisting peace talks, allows them to use the humanitarian crisis to pressure Israel through international opinion. Their goal is to remain a force in Gaza, maybe even part of a post-war government. The disaster becomes political capital.
So it really does sound like, from these analyses, both sides are finding ways to leverage this famine for political ends, while the civilians are caught in the middle, bearing the unimaginable cost.
That's the tragic picture painted by the sources, yes. Which brings us to the latest major development, the August 8th push by Israel towards full occupation.
A full occupation, what does that look like on the ground?
They're using what's described as an evacuate then destroy model, ordering civilians out of an area then moving in. It sounds methodical, but the reality for civilians is harrowing.
Why? What are the problems with that model in Gaza?
Several huge problems. First, the notice period. People get maybe 6 to 24 hours to evacuate. In a place with constant power cuts, unreliable internet. How do you even get the message out effectively? Second, the escape routes. They're limited, they're fixed, monitored by drones, there are roadblock searches. Just getting out is dangerous.
And where do they go? Are there safe places prepared for them?
That's the third problem. They're directed to so-called safe zones. But these areas often lack basic shelter, food, water. It just leads to chaos and overcrowding. And fourth, these safe zones aren't even reliably safe. Sources report they are sometimes retargeted by the Israeli military later on, forcing people to flee again and again.
Fleeing multiple times.
Yes. Gaza, the journalist, interviewed one family. They had moved 5 times with their 7 children, constantly displaced. The result is that the remaining 2 million Gazans are squeezed into this incredibly narrow strip of land along the coast and these dispersed safe zones. It covers only about 20% of Gaza's total area.
What does that mean for population density?
It's almost unbelievable. It reaches 27,000 people per square kilometer in these areas. To give you a comparison, that's 3.5 times the density of Singapore, one of the most densely populated places on Earth.
27,000 per square kilometer. It's hard to even picture. Given these current conditions, it makes you wonder why Israel might have avoided a full occupation earlier in the conflict. Did sources like Stratfor offer reasons?
Yes. Stratfor, the geopolitical intelligence firm, outlined 3 main reasons why Israel likely hesitated before. First was manpower.
Manpower.
Yeah. Drawing on U.S. experience in Iraq, they estimated that securing an occupied territory like Gaza would need about 1 extra soldier for every 50 civilians just for basic security. For Gaza's population, that meant needing an additional 40,000 troops, on top of Israel's active force of less than 170,000. A huge commitment for potentially prolonged, costly urban warfare.
Okay, manpower. What else?
Second was administration. Who would actually run an occupied Gaza day to day? Israel lacks trusted local administrators. Many experienced Palestinians were linked to Hamas, obviously unacceptable to Israel, and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority from the West Bank, had little influence or support in Gaza. So direct Israeli administration would be the alternative, but that means taking on massive reconstruction costs, that $53 billion we mentioned, clearing 53 million tons of rubble, and likely facing constant local resistance and distrust.
Makes sense. And the third reason?
Uncertainty about Hamas's actual remaining strength. Israel estimated killing around 20,000 fighters and capturing 1,500, but they also estimated that maybe 20,000 fighters remained active. Reports suggested Hamas was still recruiting, especially in the north around Gaza City, and still making use of its extensive underground tunnel network. So the fight might not have been over.
Okay, so manpower needs, administrative burdens, and Hamas's resilience were deterrents. Why the shift now, in August, towards full occupation, despite these challenges seemingly still being there?
It seems a confluence of factors. One potential influence mentioned, perhaps surprisingly, goes back to an idea floated by Donald Trump in February 2025.
Trump, what was his idea?
He suggested relocating Gaza residents and redeveloping the land, maybe for international resorts. Now, while that specific idea seemed unrealistic to many—
It's really to spark something among Israeli hardliners.
Exactly. Sources suggest it resonated with expansionist elements within the Israeli government. Figures like Finance Minister Smotrich and National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who openly advocate for establishing new Jewish settlements in Gaza and potentially annexing parts or all of it.
So the political ground shifted internally in Israel.
It appears so, and this aligns with Prime Minister Netanyahu's 5 principles for Gaza, which he announced right around the time of the August 8th push. Those principles are disarming Hamas completely, freeing the remaining Israeli hostages, around 50 at that time, demilitarizing Gaza entirely, maintaining long-term Israeli security control over the territory, and establishing a new civilian government without Hamas or Fatah.
Those sound like very maximalist demands. Disarming Hamas, demilitarization, security control. It doesn't leave much room for negotiation, does it? Especially regarding the hostages.
That's a key observation. The principles seem to prioritize military objectives, potentially over compromises that might secure the hostages released sooner. Broadening the view again, Stratfor interprets this whole strategy as a form of war for peace.
War for peace. What does Stratfor mean by that? It sounds contradictory.
It does. Stratfor's analysis suggests a few potential calculations behind this intensified military approach. First, domestically, further strikes on these now highly concentrated civilian populations might be seen as militarily easier and could potentially boost Netanyahu's approval ratings among a war-weary or hawkish public. Second, achieving and securing occupation could help Netanyahu politically, possibly allowing him to remain in power until the end of his term in October 2026.
So domestic political calculations. What about the international angle of war for peace?
The idea there, according to Stratfor, is that a significant escalation, creating an even deeper crisis, might actually pressure international powers, the U.S., Europe, the Gulf Arab states, to finally step in with concrete peace plans that would likely involve them footing the bill for Gaza's reconstruction, thus shifting that enormous $53 billion burden off of Israel.
That's a pretty cynical view of strategy, if accurate. Essentially, making the situation worse to force others to pay to fix it later.
It's certainly a stark analysis. And Stratfor acknowledges that this path, while potentially politically expedient for some leaders, will inevitably, tragically, deepen Gaza's already catastrophic humanitarian disaster.
How has the rest of the world reacted to this escalation and the ongoing crisis? Have there been meaningful actions?
We've seen some moves, but their practical impact seems limited so far. For instance, on July 24th, French President Macron announced plans to formally recognize the state of Palestine at the UN General Assembly in September.
And the UK followed suit?
5 days later, yes. UK Prime Minister Starmer pledged to do the same. And then on August 8th, German Chancellor Merz halted arms sales to Israel, specifically weapons that could be used in Gaza.
Recognizing Palestine, halting some arms sales, these sound significant.
Symbolically, perhaps. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, as our sources note, 147 out of 193 UN member states already recognize Palestine. Without Palestine having its own independent security forces, a stable financial system, or real administrative capacity on the ground, formal recognition alone changes very little about the day-to-day reality for Gazans.
So, more symbolic than substantive, at least for now. What about the United States? Their position seems key.
The U.S. stance, particularly under Trump, has been described as highly inconsistent. On July 25th, for example, he very publicly criticized Israel over what he called real hunger scenes in Gaza. Quite strong words.
But did that translate into policy pressure?
Apparently not. By August 8th, when asked about Israel's decision to push for occupation, Trump essentially deferred, saying it depends on Israel itself. The broader analysis suggests the U.S. has little appetite for direct military intervention and is primarily looking for low-cost ways to eventually achieve some kind of peace settlement. It seems content for now to let Israel take the military lead and hopes the wealthy Gulf Arab states will ultimately pay for reconstruction.
And is the U.S. focus just elsewhere right now?
That seems to be a major factor. With other global priorities, the motivation for deep, sustained U.S. intervention in Gaza appears limited.
So, amidst all this politics, strategy, international maneuvering, let's bring it back to the people. You mentioned the psychological toll earlier.
Yes. James Elder, a global spokesperson for UNICEF, visited Gaza back in June. And he described something he felt was a unique form of PTSD there. He said because new trauma arrives literally every day, the bombing, the displacement, the hunger, the fear, people don't get a chance to process the last trauma. They're forced into a state of almost numbness just to survive the present moment.
Numbness is a coping mechanism. That's incredibly bleak.
It is. And Elder shared something else that was quite profound. He said, many Gazans he spoke to, they understand the reality. They know even the UN can't magically bring them enough food or safety right now. What they wanted more than anything was just for their plight, their suffering, to be witnessed by the outside world.
Just to be witnessed, not necessarily fixed immediately, but seen, acknowledged. That's powerful. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What does it mean for people in such extreme circumstances to simply want their suffering witnessed? And what responsibility, if any, does that place on us, those of us who have access to this information, to keep learning, keep sharing, keep witnessing? This crisis in Gaza, it's such a complex, heartbreaking tangle. Military objectives, intricate political games, and just unimaginable levels of human suffering, all interwoven. It really challenges us to look past the easy headlines, doesn't it, to try and understand these connections, however difficult.
Absolutely. I think the sources we've explored today really underscore how knowledge, real understanding, isn't just about knowing what's happening. It's about grasping why it's happening, why it matters, and the real impact on real lives. It pushes us to think critically about how information itself is used, how narratives are shaped, and how even something as basic as food can become a tool in a much larger, devastating political strategy.
Well said. And as you, our listeners, continue to explore these complex global issues, just remember there's always more to learn, always different perspectives to consider. We really hope this deep dive has offered some crucial insights today.
Thank you for joining us. And one last reminder about Hui Wang's A History of China series. The updated edition with the Liao dynasty is out now. Definitely worth checking out for your historical reading list.